I'll unmask myself and keep a good social distance away from everybody here. Welcome. Thank you for coming tonight. I know it's a little bit challenging with the weather, but we can always do some jumping jacks or whatever to get warmed up if we need to somewhere along the way. But I'll talk for about 45 minutes and then about 15 minutes for questions. By the time we're done, it'll be dark and probably 5 degrees cooler. Okay, so as she said, I'm Dave Weed. I've been working on a project for about 3 years to bring back the 17th century around here. For those of you who prefer to live in another century, this will be new. But as for me and Charlie back there, we love the 17th century. It's a fabulous time in our history. So let me see if I can get this going. So I started this project when I retired. I live just off of Burrs Hill Park in Warren. If anybody's been there, it's just across from the town beach on Water Street, and fabulous little place. And I thought, gee, this is a neat place to live. I wonder what went on here. Well, one morning I woke up 3 years ago, and there's an excavator out digging a hole in the ground in the park. I thought, well, this is interesting. I wonder what that's all about. Well, lo and behold, they were digging a grave and reburying the Massasoit Osamequin, okay, along with contents of 41 other graves. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but I attended the celebration there, and that got me very interested in what was going on not only in the park, but all over this area. I had been somewhat involved in studying the King Philip War, which really gets all the attention from that time period. If anybody knows anything they know about the war. And I was involved in rededicating a memorial to Hugh Cole, who grew up in Plymouth, moved to Swansea, and was involved in the war. And now there's a memorial plaque we'll talk a little bit more about. And this woman, Helen Jader, from Barrington, who said, we really ought to do something to bring back the area called Sowams, S-O-W-A-M-S, Sowams. And I thought, what's Sowams? I've heard of Sowams Road, Sowams Elementary School in Barrington, but I didn't know a thing about that. Well, one thing led to another. I got to learn a whole lot more, and in particular, I got to learn about the people who lived here for 10,000 years. You know, you go over to Egypt or you go to Greece and you get to see places that people occupied thousands of years ago, right? Where do you go here to find the places that people occupied for 10,000 years? Long before either the pyramids or the Acropolis, okay? Well, they're difficult to find, but they're around. And I started exploring and learned about this area called Sowams. You see this here on a map that Tom Bicknell did around the turn of the 20th century. And then I learned that the tribe here was the Pokanoka Tribe. And I thought, what's that? I only had heard of the Wampanoags. Everybody's heard of the Wampanoags, right? And those are the people who met the Pilgrims. Well, I've subsequently learned that that wasn't the name of the tribe here. It was Pokanoket. And as you'll read in the booklet that's at the back of the room, the word Pokanoket was expunged after the King Philip War. You could not say you're Pokanoket without risking your life, okay? So all we hear about is Wampanoag now. But the Pokanoka Tribe was the group that occupied all of this area, all the way up toward Boston, not the Cape, but down to the Elizabeth Islands and Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket. And in this area was where the Massasoit Osamequin spent most of his time. And I say the Massasoit, why? Because that's a title, that's not his name. The English thought it was his name, but he was the great leader. That's what Massasoit means. It's like president. You don't call Eisenhower president. You say President Eisenhower. Well, Massasoit is Massasoit Osamequin, yellow feather. These are the folks who lived here all this time, and things were pretty good. As far as we know, they didn't suffer from starvation, didn't have great wars, continuously occupy this area in a sustainable way. You know, we've been here 400 years. How are we doing? For 10,000 years, until they began to see these ships arrive, okay, from Europe. That began in the 1500s. They had a whole century of everything from explorers to fishermen coming off the coast. So they knew that these people who come over on these floating islands were from somewhere else, and they traded with them, both of them to their advantage. This population, as I said, was very successful. Probably 100,000 or more of people who were living in this area over that time. And in trade, they began to get great advantages because, on the one hand, they did not have iron tools and they were able to obtain them. They didn't have woven fabric. Okay, so they were able to get fabric that was warmer and in place of furs that they were using. But then they traded those furs because the Europeans had a great appetite for furs. And particularly in the first half of the 17th century, beaver hats were in style. And you could sell all the beaver you could get your hands on. So the Plymouth people even went all the way up to Maine to establish a trading post. And that was the economy up until about the 1650s, when the styles in beaver hats went out of fashion, and suddenly you couldn't sell a beaver. So the economy collapsed, and the only thing the native people had to sell was their land. Just prior to the English people coming from England, there was a great pandemic. Gee, doesn't that sound familiar? Now we understand pandemics, right? Unfortunately, this was even more deadly than what we are experiencing right now. And that pandemic literally wiped out 90% of the population along the Massachusetts coast. We don't know precisely what illnesses that was comprised of. It may have been several. There's all kinds of speculation about that, but there's no proof of any of them. However, we do know that the pandemic was so critical that by the time the Pilgrims arrived in December of 1620, there was no one left alive in the village of Patuxet, what we call Plymouth. There was nothing but bones on the ground. Okay, there weren't enough people alive to bury the dead. In addition, half of the Pilgrims who came over also died, mostly on board the Mayflower, but that was a devastating situation. Imagine arriving at a place that had no people because of illness, and then you're getting sick and dying. I can't believe what fortitude it took to not just get back on the ship and go back to England at that point. But there they were. Fortunately, they got some help, and that help came largely from the Pokanokats, who at first did not approach them. They didn't come by there until March of the following year, 21, because they were fearful that they might obtain a disease. They didn't exactly know how, but they wanted to make sure that they weren't putting themselves at risk. So by the spring, they were able to meet with them, and Osamequin and 50 of his warriors came from where? Essentially right around here, okay, from Sowams, this area, and traveled the 40-some miles up to Plymouth and decided to make arrangements there. They were fortunate because there was an English-speaking Pokanoka there. Anybody remember his name? Squanto, Tisquantum. Also, he had been captured by Demers back in 1619, taken to Spain, then to England, and then came back to Maine and worked his way down the coast and discovered that the people he grew up with, imagine coming back to your own hometown and finding everybody dead. Okay, that's what he experienced. So when the English arrived, he was able to talk with them and make some arrangements of translation between him and Osamequin. And in that process, they were able to work out a 6-point treaty there. And I'm not going to read all of that, but basically it was an agreement that we'll help you, you help us, nobody's going to make trouble for the other person. And oh, by the way, you have to pledge your allegiance to the king. Well, that was kind of, the Pilgrims had to do that, so goes the native population there. So they sat down in this wonderful rendering and worked out this treaty. And that treaty stayed in effect for half a century or more, okay? Began to fray toward the end, and we'll talk about that. But that, compared with what was going on in the Chesapeake area with Virginia, who did not do well with the native population there and had all kinds of warfare. Half of them got wiped out. Here was a peaceful relationship that extended for half a century, which basically allowed the English settlers to come in and expand, okay? Not such a good deal if you were native. Ed Winslow, sort of the Secretary of State for the Pilgrims, began to get to know the Massasoit, and he traveled, walked 42 miles from Plymouth down to what we believe is now Warren, to meet with the Massasoit in his home. That was on July 2nd, 1621. The first time, as far as we know, that any English person had ever come to the Massasoit's home. They met there, got along fairly well. You can read a very detailed account in Mort's Relation, written largely by Ed Winslow. And then Winslow returns 2 years later in 1623 on word that the Massasoit was gravely ill. He came and met with him and administered some English cure-all potions, probably some herbs and one thing or another. And lo and behold, the Massasoit recovers from this illness. They became great friends for the rest of their lives. And that cemented a relationship that really ensured the continued survival of the colony. There's a monument to Osamequin in Warren on Baker Street. If you stop by there, there used to be a bubbling spring, but it's now just concrete. But that, we believe, was one of the places that Osamequin spent a good deal of his time. Here's Winslow administering his potion to Osamequin, and the description in Good News from New England. Definitely a good read if you're looking for a good story. It's about 3 pages long. So I often wondered, well, what was Sowams like back then? You know, you have these images in your mind of huge, dense forests with great oak trees and, you know, one thing or another, wildlife in abundance and what have you. But it turns out that they had been clearing the land there for centuries. In fact, it was largely open land. We know that because when pilgrims such as Miles Standish came and saw that, he said, this is wonderful. This is exactly what we're looking for. This looks like England. We can bring our cattle and our sheep. We can grow our grains and really expand our territory here. So it was very favored land. They set up a trading post in 1632, probably on the the west shore of the Kickameot River in Warren. And this little native village then became subject to lots of visits from the pilgrims who were looking to expand their territory. Here's Miles, always an opportunist, and basically served as their sergeant at arms, if you will. He protected and he actually got Osamequin out of trouble a couple of times with the Narragansetts. So their treaty really was enforced, and he really helped out in that process. Here are two different peoples, okay, who, one who's been here for 10,000 years, one who's inherited all of Western civilization, if you will, bringing that over here. Whereas the English thought you live on the land and you own the land, right? The people who lived here live with the land and are part of the land. They always thought of themselves as inseparable from the land. In fact, the name Pokanoka was really the name of the land here, because the Pokanoka people are the people of the Pokanoka land. You cannot separate yourself from the land. They would hunt animals, not raise them. They could never figure out what these strange beings were that were coming from Plymouth. They thought cattle were large dogs because that's the only thing that looked like that. And they never understood this idea that you would actually feed an animal and raise it to slaughter for your own food. Never had that ever occurred to them. You go to the woods and you hunt, okay? You don't raise domesticated animals in that way. You manage land, but you never acquire it. You don't own the land. You have the right to use it for hunting, fishing, what have you. But this idea of property with fences and you stay off, this is mine, never occurred to them. So they had use agreements called usufruct, not purchases of land. So when we hear things like Roger Williams purchased Providence, well, he didn't really. He had an agreement, and you signify that agreement with an exchange of gifts. So it wasn't a purchase. No, we give you the right to use this land. Religion. There were no churches in native settlements, okay? People worshiped 7 days a week because you were always in communication with the spirits around you, right? You accept what can't be controlled. This notion that you don't try to manipulate the larger environment, whereas the English were always thinking about, well, if I do good things will happen, and if I have something bad happens to me, like a great storm, that must be something that I did that created that, right? So we're always in charge of our environment. Not so. Well, here's Roger. He had gotten to know Osamequin not long after he arrived in this country in 1631 or 1630. Spent about 2 years, I believe, down in Plymouth. And in that process, because he was close enough to Osamequin, he got to know him personally, so that when he got into difficulty up in Salem and the authorities decided that he needs to go back to England and they'll escort him, he booked in January, one of the coldest Januaries that we ever experienced around here, and the next thing you know, he's walking over 60 miles from Salem down to meet Osamequin, and found him right here in what's now Swansea, okay, just over the Warren line. He was in terrible shape, could have died easily, needed help. So Osamequin sheltered him in this cave that's still there that you can see today. One of his tribal women, Margaret, took care of him, nursed him back to health over 14 weeks, and was able to get him well enough that he could go on to establish his own settlement. And Osamequin said, well, why don't you go up to what's now Omega Pond? It was really part of the Seekonk River then. That's a good place. There's a spring up there. You'll do well there. So up he went. Here's Omega Pond. How many people have been to the Roger Williams spring up here on Roger Williams Avenue? Good. Okay. It's not a frequent visit, is it? It's a little difficult to find. It's set way back from the road there. We're going to get a historic marker to interpret that before too long. But that's where he spent from about April to June, planted his crops, okay? And the next thing you know, his good buddy Ed Winslow says, got to get out of there. So, because you're on our land, this is King's land, you don't have a right to be there. So he agreed and went across the Seekonk River. These are a couple of the houses that you can still see there from the 17th century, okay? Pardon me? The Daggett house right here, right? It's a privately owned house, you can't go through it. And the Walker house, which is probably a little after 1700. But those are places that you can visit and get a taste of the 17th century. So here's Roger, who ends up in what we now call Providence. This is an imagined view of what Providence looked like in about 1650. Here's the Winooskatucket River here, the Great Salt Marsh. Here's the hill where Smith Hill is, where the State House is. Here's Newtoconnicut Hill, the western boundary of Providence, all right? So if you get a sense of this settlement along North Main Street, you get some idea of how Roger and the people he brought down from Salem were able to get along fairly well. So he even got himself a job as a bridge tender on the Weybosset Ridge at the bottom of College Street. Okay, this is the 8th iteration of the bridge. However, the bridge is still there in the same place it was in 1638. Well, 1638 they didn't have a bridge, but people would cross the river. If you're coming from the western side of the bay, this was the first place you could cross as you went north. So you could wade across at low tide. They eventually built a whole series of bridges that kept getting wiped out, and one thing or another. Roger even served as the toll tender in this later part of his life. Got to make a living, So land became the issue. And what was the first purchase in this area? Rehoboth, okay? This 8-mile square area was purchased from Osamequin and established the first town. We'll talk about that in a minute. But as you see over time, more and more acquisitions, okay? And I won't go through this because it gets very complicated. Things like Warren was Barrington, and Barrington was its own town in 1717, but wasn't split off as its own town again until 1770. That's why they celebrate 300 anniversaries. Land transfer, land management, that was the issue. But you'll notice that below all of these purchases, Bristol was never purchased. Okay? Bristol remained the land reserved for the tribe. And in 1643, not long after that Rehoboth purchase, who should come down here but Reverend Samuel Newman, and brought his congregation from Weymouth, okay, established a church. Remember, in the English world, you cannot have a town without a church. You can't have a church without a minister. can't have a minister without a parsonage. So that's the way you go. You build a parsonage, you get the minister, you build a church, and then you have a meeting house and you're a town, okay? So that first gathering in 1643, okay, became the first town, if you will, in this area, okay? Not the first town in New England, obviously, but when it comes to where you're living now, what was all of Rehoboth was the first town. This is how many have seen this kind of diagram? Yeah, if you live around here, you're probably familiar with the ring of the green, okay, where the house lots were set up in a radial fashion around a common area. The Newman Church is at the center of that. It's now basically a cemetery, but you can begin to see how these house lots were laid out, each one having fronting on the green, so you could shelter your animals, your livestock there at night especially, but also having a connection to the water, all right, including not only the Seekonk River, but also the 10 Mile River over here. So it was pretty elaborate setup and seemed to work fairly well. I don't know that there were any complaints about it. Fairly egalitarian, right? But what's interesting is if you take that and just superimpose it over a Google map today, it all fits. I'm amazed. Not far from there, on the 10 Mile River, Hunt's Mills was established in 1643. So you can't really lead an English life without mills to both mill lumber, but more importantly, food, grinding your food and your grains, and to some degree later on fabric. So all along the 10 Mile River, and there's a whole population there of early settlement. Well, this unfortunately became the problem. You now have all these English settlements around what was originally, here's Massasoit Spring, and here's where the Massasoit was spending most of his time in what's now Warren. But you start to have all these English settlements, including ones down in Warwick and down in Newport, remember, with Aquidneck Island, et cetera, all the way around. So they were essentially surrounded by English settlements. Do you think that was working well? Not really, because the English continued to bring in infectious diseases. And in 1632 or so, there was a large infectious outbreak, probably of smallpox, and many more native people died. In fact, the native population was diminishing year after year, while the English population was expanding year after year. So imagine yourself in a situation where the people around you are dying, the people you know and care about, whereas these invaders who've come in are now exploding and taking up more land and causing more problems. Not so good. This is a map I just found recently, drawn by Virginia Baker, who is an early historian in Warren. And if you can orient yourself, here you are, this is basically downtown Warren. Here's Market Street going south. I know this is oriented the wrong way, but that's the way she drew it. Here's the Kickamuit River going through here, and here's Child Street. Okay, now Route 103. You got all that? And here's Market Street coming up here. See these X's? Anybody want to guess what those were? It's a fence. A fence put up, and this is from her research where she thinks it was. Nobody knows for certain. But on the south side of Child Street, they fenced off the territory in what's the Bristol Peninsula, if you will, okay? So that was reserved for the native population. If you were English, you couldn't go south of there, and you put a fence there for one good reason, to keep your animals from going there. because they would wreak havoc in cornfields and cause major problems. So this fence was occupied from the Kickamuit River over to the Warren River, okay? I used to think it was on Franklin Street, but she says no, it's further north, because if you put it at Franklin Street, then the Massasoit Spring would not be included. Whereas if you follow Child Street all the way across Main Street, you're now on Baker Street, and the Massasoit Spring would be on the south side of that. Clever, huh? So, what happens when your population is diminishing and it looks like you're going to lose your entire civilization? You don't take it lightly. And it wasn't long before some of Philip's warriors decided that they were going to drive the English back to England, okay? And that's essentially what the purpose of the King Philip War was. It started as skirmishes. Basically, they weren't going around at the beginning shooting and killing English people. They were burning their houses. Most of the English people at the beginning were able to get out to garrison houses and survive, but many of them began moving, first to Boston, then to Newport, and then some back to England. And that was the purpose of the war, was to get rid of the people who had invaded their land and caused so many problems. We could do a whole session on the King Philip War and its causes, but if you get a sense of what was going on in that war and look at it, it got very vicious on both sides over time, and people were just killing one another. So it didn't go well. The war expanded all the way up almost to New Hampshire and Vermont. Many battles, and then came to an end in August of 1676, 14 months after it started, with the killing of Philip in Bristol, right at Mount Hope, in what's called the Miry Swamp. He was shot by a native guy who was the brother of somebody that Philip had killed because he was betraying his location to the English. So there was some personal enmity there, and Church's gun misfired, so Alderman got the shot on that. If you know the rest of the story, basically Philip was drawn and quartered, and his head was placed on a pike in Plymouth for 20 years. His hand was taken around to show people for money, etc. But the worst of it was that any of the remaining native warriors who were not killed in the war were enslaved, sent to Barbados. Why would you send a native slave to Barbados? Well, what happens if you enslave a native person right around here?
So there wouldn't be slave revolts, they'd be out of the way, right?
Well, there's that. But if you're a native person and you're enslaved in somebody's household and it's 3 in the morning, what are you going to do?
Kill all of
Yeah, you're going to leave. You're going to book. So what you do is you take the native people, ship them to Barbados, where they don't know where they are, and then you bring back some African people, okay, in trade. Interesting. So that's how slavery began after the war here, without native people being enslaved. Now, there were women and children who were enslaved here because there were less of a problem, but the warriors were pretty much gone. Essentially, the Pokanokats were banished from the area. If you look at it, that's what happened. And that's why when people say, oh, the Pokanokats, I don't know of any Pokanokats, where are they? Well, they've come back. About 300 of them now live in the area. But at the time, they didn't have that opportunity. They were told to leave under penalty of death. So we have a few remnants of that war now. This is the Miry Swamp where Philip was slain at Mount Hope. You can go there and visit this. There was a marker put there back in 1877. Also a marker. How many people have been to the marker? It's in Swansea, next to the Miles Bridge. It's easily found if you know where to go, and that marked the garrison that Reverend Miles and Reverend Hartman in the back can give you a whole story about how Reverend Miles got there. But let me just say that he had the most fortified house, so when the native people started their war, that's where people assembled. Unfortunately, it's since been torn down.
It burned in 1913.
All right, too bad. You can also go to Anawan Rock. You must know that. That's right here in town, okay? Up on Route 44. And after Philip was slain in the early part of August, then on August 28th, at the end of the month, basically his captain, Anawan, who was in his 60s at the time, when Church came with the troops, he just said, "We give." And they spent the night telling war stories to one another. Unfortunately, despite promises to the contrary, he was taken to Plymouth and hung. You can still see some remnants of that time in Swansea, the old Eddy burial ground, which isn't accessible now, but right here in town, the cemeteries, and I'll show you some more pictures of those. Ancient Little Neck Cemetery in Barrington, great place to go because Elizabeth Tilley, who came from England when she was 12, went to Leiden, then came to Holland, and then came over to Plymouth, grew up in Plymouth, lived through the King Philip War, and then settled in Riverside with her daughter, and that's where she died. Amazing life. Somebody needs to do a movie of that. This is the Serpentine Cemetery in Warren and the Tyler Point Cemetery in Barrington. But here close to home, how many people have been to the Burial Place Hill, Peckham and Providence Street? Yeah, you should stop by sometime. It's a fascinating cemetery. There's some, especially in the back, there's a stone there with a marker with the longest inscription in America, I think, something of that sort, right? But you can see evidence of that time right there because some of the people buried there fought in the King Philip War. Also over on Lake Street, just north of the Palmer Meadow Lane, is the Palmer's River Cemetery, and there's a whole story about one of the Cahoon who tried to rescue people from the Miles garrison and ended up being killed, and he was buried, but they're not sure where, and they've made some attempts to get him back to the cemetery there. How many people have seen these around town? You've got these historic markers. These are from the markers aren't from the 17th century, but they're about the garrison houses. There aren't any surviving garrison houses here, but you can see these illustrations of them at some of the markers along the road. Unfortunately, the roads in Rehoboth are as narrow as they can be, right? And there's no way to park safely. So you drive by the sign, and then you look for a driveway where you can stop and then walk back and read the sign. Anybody know this falls? Yeah, Lindy. Yeah. Butterworth. Right, Butterworth Falls. And that was one of the early mills that's still in place, okay, from the 17th century around here, okay? How about some of these places, huh? This better look familiar. We're right here. Here we are at the Carpenter Museum, and if you go right over there, right, is the exhibit on the Toby site, okay, and some of the stone tools that were found there. Where's the kettle right now? Upstairs, okay. And that was thought to be a kettle that King Philip used, right? Okay, it's been passed down. There's a little, hard to say for sure. As a story. Good. I like good stories, all right? But clearly, this is a wonderful place if you want to become familiar with not only the colonial history here, but also the archaeological history of this area, because some of these tools were used by people 3,000 years ago, okay? And some great archaeological work in this area. I've also spent some time with some of the local folks. Ted Ballard is still around. I've talked to him recently. He can talk your arm off about the archaeological work around here because he was involved in it. Unfortunately, Jim Johnson passed about a year and a half ago, I think, but I was able to get him on video. So if you go on the Sowams Heritage Area website, you can listen to him talk about the forges around here and the early attempts to take bog ore out of the mud in the river and forge tools. I never knew that was possible. And some of the illustrations from the book that you have here, right? Some of the oldest houses in town. The Kingsley House, I think, is still considered the oldest one, right? But just down the street, the Nathan Bliss House, okay, not all of it, but portions go back to 1680. The Wheeler Inglis House, probably some portion right around the turn of the century, okay. And again, the Hicks Baxter Homestead, 1698 question mark, okay. It's always difficult with these houses unless they've really been examined carefully to know. But one thing I love about Rehoboth is that you can really imagine yourself in the 17th century here, can't you? I mean, it really, in a lot of ways, it hasn't changed because it used to be wooded, then it was cleared everywhere for farming, and in the last 50 years, what's happened? The woods have all come back. Okay. And other farms in the area. This is the Key Farm over in Warren that he believes the dates to somewhere. He said, Byron said, "Oh yeah, that house was built in 1624." And I said, "No, Byron, there weren't any houses in 1624." But it's possible that some portion of his house predates 1700. Brigham Farm, we know, has never been developed. In other words, it's always been open farmland if you go over there. And I love the farm in North Warren where, now I'm blocking on the name, Chase Farm. The Chase Farm was a King's Grant farm from 1697, okay? And it's been a farm ever since then. They're struggling, but it's an example of how little some places have changed around here. And then all the natural areas, some of these are in Barrington. This is down in Bristol. This is Hampton's Woods going through the center of Barrington near Sowams Road. You could still find places that have not been touched by European civilization, let's put it that way, okay? And if you're traveling on Route 136 going from Swansea into Warren, this is across the street from Johnson's Market, okay? When the brush is cleared away in the fall, you'll see this, what I believe is a perched rock on a granite outcropping. I'm trying to get a native person to come there and verify that. But this kind of thing happened all over New England, where native people would perch large boulders on granite outcroppings. This was called Sacham's Knoll, so we know it had Native American significance at the time. And across the street from that is King's Rock, which was known as the National Grinding Stone, because on the top of this rock, there was a groove down the center where Native women would roll a rock to grind corn. So that's all been reported. I'm trying to get a marker there on the side of the road so people could stop there at Johnson's Market and take a look at some of these things. Here we are driving past native remnants. Remember I was saying about you can't see the Acropolis here? Well, this is the Acropolis. Okay. Oh yeah, see? And I have a little sign inside the store to try to direct people, but we need a marker, a pull off there, the whole thing, okay? And then behind Swansea Town Hall is Abrams Rock. This is up in Mount Hope, where King Philip's seat is. And this is in Newtoconachet Hill. How many people have been to Newtoconachet Hill? Ah, I got you all stumped. It's the western boundary of Providence. It's the highest point in Providence, almost 300 feet high. There's a beautiful park up there. And if you walk up there, here's a meeting place where native tribes used to come together because it was a meeting place between the Massachusetts, the Nipmuc, the Narragansett, and the Pokanoka. So it's again, this is the Acropolis, okay? But nobody knows. Houses around here, English houses, sure, you can find them over in Barrington. In Swansea, the Martin House is probably older than the 1720 date that's on it. Halnoon's Farm, about 1682 on the Market Street in Warren as you go in. William Hunt House over in Seekonk, oldest house in Seekonk. And I love this one. That's the Bosworth House. It says Perry Rego House. As you come into Bristol, that house is right across from Sip and Dip, just before the creek there where they're working on the bridge, okay? Obviously, it has not been restored, but that is the first house built in Bristol, okay, 1680. And as we said earlier, that was the house they built to get the pastor there so they could have a church, so they could have a town, okay? So you build that in 1680, and by 1684, they had a meeting house and a town. But wouldn't it be wonderful to get that restored? Somebody have $1 million or $2 million they'd like to invest? Okay. Well, here we are back to wrap up. This is the monument to Osamequin in Burrs Hill Park in Warren. This is the crypt where he and the remains of 42 native grave sites that were excavated, removed in 1913 by Charles Carr, the town librarian, who decided that because people were just digging up skeletons and burial objects and taking them home, that he needed to do something. So I guess he protected them. They went off to museums all over, the Hay Museum, the Brown, Heffenreffer, Harvard, whatever. Well, the Mashpees, not the Pokanoka, Mashpee tribe on the Cape, because they were federally recognized, were able to go around and demand those items back. Collected over 600 burial objects as part of the Native American Gravesite Reclamation Act in 1992. Got those, gathered them, held a ceremony, and reinterred them in a vault under the ground. So we believe that the Massasoit was one of those because Virginia Baker had found items in a gravesite at Burrs Hill that had gold lace that was part of a horseman's jacket, a red horseman's jacket that was given to Osamequin by Ed Winslow, okay? So he wasn't going to give it to somebody else. So we're pretty certain that the Massasoit is in that grave, and he is back there. Part of the Royal Burial Ground, and there's now, I've got a marker there so you can go and read all about it. So, am I going the wrong direction? Here we go. One more. And this is the Pokanoka Tribe today. Here's the Tribal Council a couple of years ago. This is at, I had them come to the opening of the Sowams Heritage Area project. Here they are up at Mount Hope in Heffenreffer property and at Brown University property at Mount Hope in southern Bristol. And they continue to have ceremonies. They have they didn't this year because of the COVID, but they do an annual Strawberry Thanksgiving Festival and have over 300 people there. So I'm working on creating a heritage area You all heard of the Blackstone Valley Heritage Area? Well, why not a Sowams Heritage Area? That would go from Providence to Bristol, okay, encompass over 50 locations. You can read all about them in the brochure back there, or better yet, go on the website and you'll see descriptions of everything. A couple hundred pages on that website, so you'll get lost in that. But like the Blackstone, we would be eligible for federal funding for that, and the Carpenter would be one of the principal locations in that. So we would direct people here so people could find some of the wonderful things that you have here. The problem with the stuff that we have in our area, here's the map. Nobody knows where any of this is, right? So the first thing you have to do is help people find it. And we've put these all on the map and hopefully made it a little easier, but won't be long before everybody's familiar. So you're going to take these brochures home and tell all your friends and neighbors, right? Okay, and go around and visit some of them, all right? Talk it up, okay? That's what we need, because we'll eventually have our congressman sending a bill to Washington saying, Sowams Heritage Area needs funding. Yeah. What do you think? Yep. Okay, that's my story and I'm sticking to it. I'll be happy to take any questions you have. Sure.
Yeah, you mentioned those fences earlier.
Yep.
Boundary.
Yep.
Are you talking stone walls?
More likely the split rail fences. It made fences out of all kinds of things. It's whatever you had that was available. Split rail is a little easier to do. Stone take a lot more work. The native people weren't all that interested in doing stone fences. Stone fences will work for cattle and pigs and things of that sort, but if you want to keep people out, you have to have something higher. So sometimes they would build stone fences and then put a split rail at the top to keep people from going there. But you know, there's a whole, if you want to talk fences, get a hold of Tim Ives. He's the state archaeologist for Rhode Island, and that's his whole thing is stone fences. And he's got a number of videos. Just put it in YouTube. Stone fences, Tim Ives. Other questions?
You mentioned the boulders on the granite outcroppings that Native Americans used.
Yep.
Was this marked like as a landmark?
They were ceremonial. You have to understand that they lived in a world that very few of us have any understanding of. It was a natural world. Things in nature were filled with spirits. Everything had meaning. Things were alive. Everything had what's called manitou. It's a spirit. Okay, so the way they saw the world is very different than the way we see it. But they studied the stars. They knew their star systems, very similar to, people in the Middle East who learned all the stars. They also knew about solstices, setting suns and things of that sort. So they followed all of that. So a lot of the ceremonial stones were markers, what are sometimes called calendar rocks, because they would point to summer solstice, winter solstice, things of that sort. If you want to really get into that, there's a whole study of it with the New England Archaeological Foundation, I think. I don't have that one right, but there are places in Connecticut, for instance, that have just hundreds of ceremonial stones. There are probably many around here. We just don't know where they are. Okay. There was another question? Yeah.
I wasn't clear where Margaret Rock was.
Well, if you're, you know where Johnson's Market is? That's a good, if you go south on 136 past Johnson's Market and take the next left, that's Birch Swamp Road, okay, and follow that, and then it goes through two curves. At the second curve, there's a driveway that goes straight across. If you were to walk down that driveway and then knock on Keith Morton's house and say, I want to go to Margaret's Rock, if he was available, he would be happy to lead you out there. But it's about not even a quarter of a mile from there. It's on private land, owned by Charlie McCoy as the physician. They're all wonderful people there, and I lead walks out there. If you're really interested in going there sometime, leave me your name and email, and I'll put you on the list for the next walk. We take groups of about 15 people out there a couple of times a year. Other questions? Yeah, Lindy.
Well, I noticed that you still have that video of previous walks. So
I have several videos. Right, so if you go on the website and just look at Aboriginal sites, and then one of the first ones will be Margaret's Rock. Click on that, and there'll be links to 2 or 3 videos of walks out there. So you can, it's a lot easier to do that than it is to trudge through the snow or the rain or one thing or another.
But it is a good, it's a good.
You've been on it?
Yes,
Yep.
I was on it and enjoyed the hike, and it was a thrill to be there
Yep.
and see it.
And Keith does such a wonderful job.
I understand.
Yep.
That was their northern, their winter.
That, we believe it was a winter encampment because it was sheltered from the wind by the rock and far enough inland that they would have access to hunting, but close enough still to the Warren River so that you could do some fishing and clamming on open days, things of that sort. I'm sure, you know, you got to figure, if somebody's been living here for 10,000 years, they figured out all the good places, right? And I think, unfortunately, the English just said, oh, now that you've found all the good places, we're moving in, okay? And it's just hard to imagine what it was really like back then. So you really have to kind of think about, you know, erase all the asphalt, take down all the telephone wires, remove all the buildings, get rid of the roads, turn them into trails, you know, and you start to get, you know, I just wish there were a way to recreate some of that, you know. Other questions? If not, are you warm enough? Okay. Wait, about ready to throw a log on the fire, okay? Well, thank you very much. You've been a very intended audience there. Thank you. And please help yourself to literature back there. I've got brochures. I've got a bunch of tour guides for all 6 different tours around the area that you can do on your own.